Welcome and thank you all for joining us from around the country for this week's Pro Perspective, the insider's look at all things commercial real estate. I'm your host, Yannis Papadakis, Business Development Manager at Crexi in our auction department. Today we are zoomed in with Sean Lyons and Tobias of Triad Real Estate. Sean is a founding partner of Triad Real Estate Partners, who has close to 15 years of experience selling investment real estate, both in Chicago and throughout the country. Before starting Triad, Sean was the CFO at Untitled Chapter as a director of its national multi-housing group. He concentrated his efforts on selling apartment properties on the north side of Chicago and in several markets. He also has serviced his clients by diversifying the real estate investment portfolios and helping facilitate their 1031 exchanges into other product types. We actually talk about that. Sean has brokered the sale for more than $900 million worth of investment property in over 175 transactions, including over 9,000 apartment and home units. Also with us, Ryan is a founding partner of Triad Real Estate Partners. He began his career also at Untitled Chapter, focusing on multifamily and student housing properties in Chicago, throughout Illinois. He went on to work at Benzlinger firm's multifamily business while working extensively on office and industrial transactions. Since 2010, he has focused most exclusively on student housing and now heads up Triad. He's recognized as a leader in the industry and has been a speaker at the Interfaith Student Housing Conference, Real Estate Journal's Student Housing Summit, and at the Real Estate People Student Housing Real Estate Summit. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, Yannis, I think you're getting some notifications the sound's breaking up.
Oh, okay. Let's take a look here. Audio's going in and out. Okay. Let me try to fix that here. Are we sounding any better now?
Yeah, that sounds better.
Great. Yes. Sorry if you missed some of the bio. I'll go ahead and post it later. But as a quick logistics reminder for our viewers, there is a Q&A box and a chat feature. So we already found that. If you can ask questions in the Q&A box, we'll try to answer a few different times throughout the show. With that, let's get the conversation going. Now, pose it to both of you. How did you first started working with student housing?
So I think we sold our first student housing deal maybe go back to 2007. So 13 years ago now. We were working in really secondary, tertiary markets around the Midwest. And those happened to be, many of those were college towns. So we're working in South Bend, Indiana, and Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Champaign, Urbana, and Bloomington Normal, Notre Dame, Western Michigan, University of Illinois, Illinois State. And we started to, in the process of just looking at apartment properties, started to see a lot of student housing. At that time, in the mid to late 2000s, student housing was a fairly nascent industry. It was very specialized, and there was a handful of brokers around the country that specialized in that, and certainly a handful of developers as well. But still, on many of these campuses, there might have been 1, 2, 3 purpose-built student housing properties. But we could see that there was a wave coming, and after doing our first deal, I think maybe our first deal might have been in Notre Dame. We started to focus on that almost exclusively for about a 10-year run there. Just seeing a niche in the space that not everyone was seeing.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, we realized pretty quickly that, we're traditionally multifamily guys, but we saw a lot of the similarities in student in terms of, sort of the way they operated. And we saw a lot of buyers coming over from multifamily into the student housing space because they were attracted to the, rent by bed. And so that we really kind of said, instead of being jack of all trades, master of none, let's focus in on this niche and really try to become experts on it.
And you get to my next point here, which is, can you describe some of the fundamentals that you look at when taking a look at student housing? What do you evaluate?
Well, in student housing, obviously the major demand driver, economic driver for the property, for the whole region is going to be the university. So location, old adage in real estate, obviously, but being close to campus, being walkable is always one of the primary ones we're looking at. In evaluating student housing, you're looking at the depth of the student market, the enrollment trends, the demographics of the students and their parents, the development pipeline coming in. Much the same that you're looking at any real estate, but it's a smaller ecosystem, and so it can be upset more easily. It'd be the same thing as looking at a multifamily property in a town of 25,000. If the one plant in town reduces their employee count, it's going to have a significant effect. So it's similar with universities. They rent by the bed. They rent typically 1-year terms, but some markets are on academic year leases, which would be like a 9.5 or 10-month leases. They're typically furnished. They typically have parental guarantees. If they don't, that could be a big red flag as well. So there's a number of differences in kind of looking at student housing versus multifamily, both for good and for bad.
Yeah, I would say too, Yannis, just to add to that, the one thing that we really see a lot of is people look at this space as sort of an entire asset class. And what they may not realize is that every single market is its own unique animal. So you're really underwriting the school and the specific market more so than the asset class. And one mistake we see happen a lot is, it's really the profile of the kid, the student that's going to the school. For example, I know one, developer who has 8 different properties throughout the Southeast. They're all the exact same product type, and he gets 8 different rent levels based on the fact that, depending on sort of the profile of the school and the student that goes there. So I think that's a really important point to understand.
And
yeah, okay. Sorry, I was going to go ahead and just add to that a little bit. I mean, we get asked all the time of kind of general questions about student housing, and this probably applies to all asset classes. But I mean, it is just impossible to really compare various student markets to one another. I mean, the market in Auburn, Alabama versus the market at the University of Washington or NYU or Illinois State are basically worlds apart. I mean, COVID has only sort of exacerbated that, and that some of these markets are really kind of almost thriving in this, and some are the complete opposite. But it is, I think, more than most asset classes, really, really, market to market.
And so it's intrinsically tied to the nearby university, no matter where it is. But I'm sure there's also an aspect too, depending on where the university is, that kind of transcends that too. I was just reading an article about a student housing building was just purchased in Tucson because of its attractive location by the downtown, that they can convert some of it into traditional multifamily as well. Now,
yeah, you see some crossover like that. But it's challenging. I mean, it really depends on the unit mix. So sometimes you're right. Sometimes there'll be a project that's built that could be potentially attractive to grad students, young professionals, and whatnot. Maybe it's a little heavier studio 1-2 bedroom type unit mix, like you might see in conventional multifamily. Just happens to also host a lot of students. The student heavy products, which usually are not always, but often more dependent on the larger format bedroom counts of 4-bedroom units, or even in some markets 5- and 6-bedroom units. Obviously, those attract more of an undergraduate student profile. It's a roommate situation that's by the bed that is just never going to work for a 28-year-old or a 35-year-old or empty nester in a way that a 1- or 2-bedroom might.
Yeah, and on top of that, one of the key fundamentals is, what does the shadow market look like? Meaning, what's the competitive set, that you're going up against? So if you're in an urban infill environment, like a Boston University, for example, you're competing against a number of, just standard apartment buildings that, are in a city. If you're in Iowa State, in Ames, Iowa, you're competing against a number of other purpose-built student housing properties. So a lot of it, when you're looking at a market, you really have to look at what is the competitive set that you're up against and how do you compare.
Interesting. Now, how do regional regulations or institutional differences affect the space?
Well, there's not a lot. I mean, certain municipalities will not have different regulations as it pertains to bed counts and things like that. But it's more market to market and what, how it has historically been done. And that's sort of homogenizing across the country as more and more national, institutional type companies own larger portfolios. They're bringing those national conventions and rules that they're applying across their portfolio. But they're, again, kind of going at market to market. I mean, some markets have always been a 10-month lease. You just sign for the time you're there, and in the summer you go home. That's somewhat changing, but that's just been a trend. Or the parental guarantees. Now, most national owners require parental guarantees. Historically, that hasn't always been the case, and there are plenty of markets out there where it's still not the norm to have parental guarantees. But again, it's not so much a regulation; it's just a pattern that's been in place there for a long time, market to market. And again, I think most of that is changing as the entire space becomes more institutionalized.
But it does have a lot to do with supply demand and sort of keeping that in balance. The markets, there's 5 or 6 that come to mind off the top of my head. But let's use like Texas A&M, for example, had very little regulation as far as being able to come in and build new product. And so what happened there, and has happened at a number of larger schools, is a very large number of new beds came online in a very short period of time. So you had a lot of new supply without the demand level, sort of maintaining pace. And so the markets that have done the best have held up, well over time, are the ones that did a better job of constraining new supply and making sure that, demand was in check. Because we've seen that's been the most common mistake, is too much, too fast in a market that doesn't necessarily need it.
Generally, can you speak a little bit to some of the differences in the markets? Like, for example, what are you seeing in the Southeast right now?
A ton of building.
Yeah, I mean, the Southeast is a market, generally speaking, is one that's got continued growth and continued development. In student housing, just like the rest of the country, I mean, you can kind of, call it the smile states, the sunshine states and whatnot. I mean, that's kind of where you're seeing population growth. That means you're seeing more high school seniors graduating every year. Certain colleges around the country obviously command kids from all over the country and all over the world. But there's a larger number of schools that pull, more regionally or statewide, and that's generally your state public schools, your largest schools. And that's why you see huge growth numbers at schools like University of South Florida, or even University of West Florida, Central Florida. I mean, areas that are just growing. So continued development and continued enrollment growth in Southeast, for sure.
Yeah, I also think you look at, we like to talk about it as like the 3 rings. So if you have a school that is, 10, 15,000 plus, which there are a number of those in the Southeast, you have the first ring, which is, you can walk to campus, and that's obviously where everybody wants to be. You have the second ring, which is within a mile of campus, and, you can bike or, take a bus or even walk if you had to, but most kids don't. But then you have that third ring, which is, a mile to 3 miles out. And as soon as you start seeing a lot of product going up in that third ring, because students really don't like being that far from campus if they can avoid it, that's when, the warning signs start going up that you may have too much supply, like I mentioned earlier. And so we're seeing that a lot in the Southeast, where that third ring is being developed at a pretty rapid pace because the first and second ring, there's nothing available.
And that actually brings up a good question from one of our attendees. Thomas Songer says, is student housing development still as active as it has been? Here at Penn State main campus, many of us local developers, non-student housing, thinks our market is quickly becoming overbuilt.
So Penn State specifically, yeah. So, Penn State is a perfect example of, big skate school, great university, great football team, good demographics, gets a lot of kids from the East Coast. That's a school that is kind of really catching up right now. It didn't have a ton of development in the 2000s and the early 2010s in a way that some schools, had a dozen projects of that size, had a dozen projects built in that time period. They had a handful, and they've really blown up in the last couple of years, really kind of in that urban core area between College Ave, off of College Ave there, just a couple blocks off campus. And you've seen most of the big players in our space, not most, but several of the big players in our space, Landmark, CA Ventures, et cetera, have built projects there. I think that, that you are going to see a slowdown in that market once these, of this big wave kind of gets absorbed. Some of the low-hanging fruit, as far as development sites, has now been scooped up. There's just not as much left to go on. And I really do think they're getting somewhat caught up after lagging a little bit in student housing development for years.
Yeah, I think too, and this is something that we don't hear as much because you tend to listen to these student housing or webinars, and they're always they paint a kind of very rosy picture. But Ryan and I like to think that we're realists. And one of the things that we're definitely seeing right now is student housing 5 years ago was the belle of the ball. We were trading at really aggressive cap rates, and a ton of new money was coming in, both nationally and internationally. And we've really seen that start to cool off a little bit. Fannie and Freddie have pulled back significantly from the space, and they were really driving hard on the lender side. And so I think that these next 2 years, particularly in hopefully a post-COVID world, are going to be really telling as to what the space looks like going forward. But I think that, we're kind of in the dust settling period as far as it being, a really hot asset class, which it's been for the last decade.
And then Sarah Yella asks, Sean, when you spoke about the three rings, same hold true for graduate student housing, or do you find a higher demand for that kind of housing in the third ring?
Yeah, so graduate students are much less discerning when it comes to, amenities and all the bells and whistles. They're there to study more or less and not party as much. So we see a lot of grad students going into that shadow market, like I described, which is, vintage, older, multifamily building, not necessarily a property built for students, like what we've seen, in the past decade. But they're really looking for value. And honestly, they kind of want peace and quiet. They don't want to be in the middle of all the noise. And so we find a lot of times they'll go anywhere where they can get, sort of good product at a fair price, and they don't really care about all the amenities. Got
it. Angela Powers asks, any commentary on Las Vegas, UNLV?
We've looked at a couple of properties in that market before. There's very little true purpose-built student housing. I think there's maybe two properties now and a third one on the way. It's a challenging market to really wrap your arms around, and this actually piggybacks perfectly on what Sean was just saying, in that the quote unquote shadow market is really the dominant market there. I mean, that's a commuter school historically that's right in the middle of a major metro area. It's surrounded by apartments. They're not necessarily pure student housing, but they're apartments. And I think that generally speaking, that's what kids have lived in, or they've lived at home. And so it's a challenging one to kind of wrap your arms around and say this is the student market here, because it's just sort of nebulous as to how many kids are actually living there, what percentage of the student body would like to live in true purpose-built student housing and can afford it. And that's why you've seen only a handful of projects thus far. And if they're successful, then obviously there'll be more. But that's a little bit of a unique market. And there are a lot of urban student markets like that. UNLV is just one example.
Yeah, the biggest thing I would look at there is the spread between what does it cost to rent a bed in a new construction purpose-built student housing property compared to renting an older apartment building that is not purpose-built but is well located and functional. And if that spread is significant, you're going to have a problem filling up beds. And I think that UNLV has come up against a little bit of that. Just because it's really hard to justify, say, $500 more a month to rent a purpose-built, bed, when you could rent, 80s apartment building, 1 or 2 bedroom in there for significantly less. That's where I think you really run into problems with filling these deals up.
Right. And moving along on our talk track here, what were the historic trends of student housing properties leading up? What did we kind of going in?
So, the asset class historically, really kind of started to mature probably in the early 2000s. There's some examples really kind of in the late 90s, but kind of came of age in the 2000s. Most of that was, what would be classified as sort of second or third ring, is what Sean is talking about, which is to say garden style, by the bed, fairly highly amenitized type product that was built in that time period. That still continued at certain markets, but really into the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s, shifted to be more of the urban, really truly walkable deals. And that was the kind of the prevalent product type, I'd say, at most markets. Again, every market is different. Some smaller towns that have abundant land are completely different than others that are kind of hemmed in, East Coast or Midwest or California type schools. And so, now the trend is really just more, I think, opportunistic, in that a lot of the quote unquote low hanging fruit is sort of gone, whereas it's like, it's a chunk of, whether that's 20 acres, it's relatively close to campus, or that could be zoned, or if it's a site right across the street from campus that could be bought or assembled. Most of that has happened. And so it's, it's market to market where there's really opportunity. And there's a question here about market saturation. And it's just, there are certain markets I think that have plenty of runway left. They've got higher barriers to entry and good and strong enrollment growth. And there are a lot of markets, more so than the ones that have runway. There are a lot of markets that are probably, for the time being, are sort of all set, or if not overbuilt. The kind of second tier schools in a lot of places like the Northeast and the Midwest that are not really high growth areas, there is a fair amount of saturation.
Yeah, and I think too, on related to trends, we talk about this all the time because, as Ryan mentioned, we got into student housing around 2007, and since then, the arrow has been pointed directly up in the asset class the entire time. So that's 13 years of just a straight, up cycle where there's never been a correction in pricing or value, basically because, the runway has been sort of smooth sailing to date. Now, we were talking about a pricing correction being necessary, about a year before COVID, because cap rates were compressing to the point where they were basically in line with a value add multifamily deal. But you have significantly more lease up risk and significantly more operational risk in student housing. So you should be rewarded for that. And we were starting to see that just completely go away. So we thought the trend would be that, pricing would start to correct, and needed to correct. And then COVID hit. And now everybody's trying to figure out, where we go from here.
Yeah, that's you're on mute.
And of course, what's on everybody's mind, the pressing issue today is the C word, COVID. What has the impact been? What are we seeing? And I mean, there's a lot to dig into there, so I'll kind of let you.
We have no opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an impossibly broad question, and it's really obviously too soon to sort of try to even attempt to answer it. Again, market to market, you'll hear us say that a lot because it really is. I mean, you've got California schools that are, fully online and really, really more remote learning, and schools in other parts of the country that are predominantly in person or some mix, and so that those are affected very differently. By and large, the asset class has held up pretty well in COVID. I'd say better than almost anything, other than maybe, distribution, logistics, industrial, maybe multifamily, but we'll see. The thing is, most kids still want to be, they don't want to be at home. They don't want to be studying out of their parents' basement. And there's also, at a lot of schools, the dorms have been either reduced capacity or closed altogether. And so you've got a greater pool of underclassmen that are out there in the off-campus student housing market. So I think ACC reported, or the primary REIT in the student housing industry and the largest owner in the country, that they're at between 90 and 91% occupied this year, down from like 97. That's probably a pretty good indication of what the market is as a whole, somewhere between 5 and 7 points down. Some markets are, in our part of the world, Michigan State's a good example. I mean, they closed all their dorms. I mean, everything there is 100%, not everything, but virtually. Other markets with heavy international student enrollments, for example, and all remote learning, they're much, much lower. But by and large and on average, the whole industry is down by, a handful of percentage points. Has sort of withstood it thus far. We'll see from here how the semester looks and next semester looks and pre-leasing for next year, but that's where it stands in, September of 2020.
And I think, one of the sort of unforeseen, results of COVID is, and I would put this more in the luck than design category, but, when these purpose-built student housing properties all have their own, we call it bed bath parity, right? So they all have their own bathroom and their own bedroom, for the most part. And so you sort of have your own individual space, which is very COVID friendly, particularly compared to like what Ryan mentioned. You have these 60s, 70s antiquated dorms where 50 people are sharing a bathroom on a floor. Mom and dad don't want to see that. So there's definitely been a sort of immediate short-term kind of benefit to off-campus student housing that, was somewhat unforeseen. The other kind of 2 points there, and we get this question a lot, is, what are collections like? And do students stay? Let's say you go back, like what happened at Notre Dame and North Carolina, multiple other schools where, they went back to school and then they immediately moved to online a week later because there was an outbreak. So the first question is, collections, to Ryan's point, are hovering, in the high 80s to low 90s. much better than everybody anticipated. They thought that, there was going to be a sort of a big drop off there, and that hasn't really materialized. And secondly, we're hearing and seeing that when kids go back to school and they move back in, they stay. So even if it goes back, by and large, not everybody, but if they move to online classes, a lot of times the kids, they don't want to go back home, and honestly, mom and dad don't really want them to come back home if there's been, 1,000 cases of COVID on the campus. Some of them quarantine and they're using some of these dorms, taking them offline and using them to quarantine students. So I think that it's, we're sort of all of the metrics of what we anticipated was going to happen haven't come to fruition in a negative light the way that we thought they would.
And I think that anybody can see the evidence that that's true, that the students rather be on campus. I mean, you just see news report after news reports of, students gather. They'd rather get COVID and be with their friends on campus than be at home, Zooming into their classes. And, that brings an interesting question too, because we've got a question here from Steven. Several universities have changed their policies and now requiring freshmen and sophomores to live on campus, which will reduce the off-campus student population and possible pricing wars. Do you have any strategies for this? Plus, looking in the crystal ball, what do you see post-COVID for student housing?
So the sophomore live-on, most universities have a freshman live-on requirement and some have a sophomore. Most of those policies have been in place for a long time, but we have seen some change in that. The strategy, there's not a brilliant strategy in that, other than I'd say that the universities that are going to be looking to require sophomores to live on campus tend to be smaller universities or those with enrollment or economic challenges. And the reason they do that is that dorms are a revenue generator. Okay, and so for universities got declining enrollment, they may have more dorms than they need. They're going to look to maybe backfill those with sophomores, or really small liberal arts schools. You see this a lot. They're trying to build up a residential campus and require more kids to live on campus. I'd say that the strategy to avoid that would be looking at healthier, larger universities by and large. There's been a couple limited examples of Ohio State would be one that had enacted a sophomore live-on requirement. But for the most part, you're going to avoid that looking at larger, healthier schools.
Yeah, I think, this is my crystal ball, but I think what you're going to see as a result of COVID is universities are going to upgrade their on-campus living facilities to be more competitive with the off-campus properties. So, one misconception is, that these off-campus properties are somehow affiliated with the university, and they're not. They're all independent, owners, operators, developers who, basically are benefiting from, the students living there. Well, turns out universities aren't thrilled with that idea because, as Ryan mentioned, on-campus housing is a very big revenue generator for schools. And so I think that you're going to see a lot more development on campus than off campus in the next 5 years. So these schools can essentially compete with the purpose-built deals that are available, in the market.
Interesting. We've got another question here too from Michael Vicker. In a rapidly growing college town such as Champaign, University of Illinois, basic amenitized student housing development supply has finally met demand in the last 2 years. Now, specialized properties are being developed, such as mini communities, 4+ miles off campus in secluded locations that offer transportation and even more amenities than any other product in the market. Is that outermost ring, or fourth ring, if you will, development at all? Is the transportation for residents a reasonable model to follow to justify that distant development?
I don't really think so. I mean, we're very, very familiar with the Champaign market. Both Sean and I have been there dozens and dozens of times. We've invested in deals in that market as well. I mean, we really know that market well. There's just, again, there's no real substitute for location. So when a product is shiny and new, and it's got all the new amenities, it's got everything that you look for, it tends to lease up. But in the long term, it's, the inevitability there is it's going to slip to be a B property, and then maybe further from that, depending on it. So almost without fail, the higher vacancy nationally is in that third tier stuff that is, a mile and a half plus, or if it's 3+ miles, I mean, that's like, the fourth tier or whatever you want to call that. That's where the vacancy is almost always going to be the highest. And so generally speaking, no, we don't think those are great long-term plays, although they're a heck of a short-term deal if you want to develop and sell them.
I think too, we've seen this consistently. The two biggest amenities that students care about is location and speed of internet access. And everything else is secondary. And frankly,
fitness center, maybe.
What's that?
It's a fitness center, maybe.
Fitness center,
yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
What we hear time and time again is these over-amenitized properties. A lot of the stuff, the kids don't even use. We've sold deals at Purdue that have, pool decks that, the kids aren't really, it might help rent a bed, but, is it something that the kids really utilize? And so I think if you're looking at amenities, location and high-speed internet access are the two biggest priorities for kids. I think you're on mute, Yannis.
Okay, so moving right along here, we actually have we've got a ton of questions that have kind of flooded in. Sarah Yella asks, can you speak about off-campus housing that is rented in blocks by the universities?
I'm sorry, the off-campus housing that's been what?
Off-campus housing that is rented in blocks by the universities.
Like a master lease?
Oh, master lease?
Yeah.
That's a unique situation. Don't see it very often. See that more often at smaller schools or places where there's limited on-campus supply and they have to do that. I don't know, case by case. I don't know that I really have an opinion on it necessarily. I mean, we don't see it very often. I can tell you that. I mean, I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of student housing deals. Those that had a master lease from the university, I could count on one hand. So, and most of those I think have gone away, in the long run.
And I think the ones that we have seen, typically relationship based. So, the developer or the owner will, have some tie into the university that, allows them to get that kind of arrangement set up. But for the most part, they're really kind of two totally separate entities, on campus and off campus. And, in a way, they really kind of compete with one another.
So now that students have returned, what are they doing? And I know, you mentioned that the individual bedroom models kind of give students a safe individual space to be in, on their own. How do you see this? How are they utilizing spaces now, and how do you see developers now? Do you see either private developers looking to build student housing take COVID into consideration when designing spaces? Universities following that path too, to give more space?
It's a good question. I think everybody in our industry and every real estate class is trying to work through what that's going to look like. It's a challenge because we've got, let's say, 6 months of data on this, and the real estate development cycle is long, and so understanding what's what's relevant now, what's going to be relevant 2 years from now, 3, 4, 5 years from now, I think is a challenge, because those design decisions you make today are with you for a long time. I mean, obviously, bed bath parity is good. I think, I've seen a lot about, touchless elevators and things like that. But I don't know if that's going to be as critical now that we're kind of seeing more research that this is really more airborne than it is hands and such. It's a tough one. I kind of have to punt on that a little bit, because I genuinely think that it's too early to be able to make a commitment to say firmly, this is what the new world is going to look like, and this is what we're going to develop when we build this thing starting next year that's going to open 2 years from now. If I had the answer to that, I might keep it a secret, because that would be true crystal ball stuff. So.
I think you're, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but the result of this is going to be a significant upgrade in the infrastructure of what on-campus housing looks like. So, I don't think in a post-COVID world, 50s, 60s, 70s style dorms that are really antiquated and just not functional in 2020 are going to either have to be knocked down and rebuilt, or given a significant facelift to adapt to kind of the new normal.
And have you noticed in this last, this fall lease up, have students changed the characteristics of what they're finding desirable in student housing? It's a question from Sarah Yella here. You find that COVID has changed the characteristics that are desirable in student housing?
Not really, I wouldn't say. I think about the properties that we've looked at in the last month or two, and those that, that we own or invested in, that we're privy to, obviously their leasing and financials. And I would not say there's been any real discernible trend that's different this year versus last year as far as what unit types. The biggest thing that I could say is that the international student enrollment is down pretty significantly. That's not all COVID related. Some of that is just sort of visa, geopolitical type of stuff. And those students tended to rent more studios and one bedrooms, less of I've got 3 buddies from the suburbs and we're all going into a 4-bedroom together. You're talking about an individual student, on a visa from China or wherever. They were more likely to live in a smaller unit type. So the smaller unit types, which we kind of thought actually would be a beneficiary of COVID, to say, all right, I'm not going to have roommates. That'll reduce my exposure risk. But it turned out that those were being driven so much by international students. Someone brought up University of Illinois, which has a huge international population. Same thing. That's where we saw some vacancy and because they weren't here. But the domestic kids were here in bigger numbers and renting up to larger unit types as they typically do. So that was one thing. Only somewhat COVID, obviously somewhat COVID related. I don't know that that's necessarily a year-to-year trend, if that will look the same next year and years afterward, but certainly it's somewhat this year.
Yeah, I think I think the trend is moving away from, what we were calling the amenities arms race, which was happening over the past 5 years. You were seeing, lazy rivers with movie theaters and, rooftop pools. Some of these properties look like, boutique Vegas hotels. I think that we're moving away from that and sort of reverting to the mean of, it sounds cliche, but, quality product at an affordable price. Seems like that's kind of always the trend when you have, something that kind of skyrockets up and then levels out a little bit. And so I think that students are less concerned about all the bells and whistles that they were, 5 years ago, and more concerned with, getting a good value. And as a result, we look at a lot of these properties, that are underwriting, 3 to 5% rent growth a year, over a 10-year hold. And we just do not think that that trend is realistic at all.
We've got some more questions that have come in. We're going to, unfortunately, have more questions than we can actually get to, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. If anybody came late to this and missed the first part or would like to see the recording, you can email me, Yannis, Yannis, at Crexi.com. I'll put that in the chat as well. You can also get in touch with our guests. I'll ask if gentlemen, you could put your emails in the chat too. That way, anybody that we don't get to their question here during this, they can reach out to you directly. But while we are here, let's try to get to a few more. We've got Manish Manat. What is current expectation of vacancy rates for the 2021-22 school year given COVID issues? And 2, what would be the top 3 sustainability strategies for current owners, operators in COVID?
So the question was occupancy for next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think next year may be a little bit too far out to even postulate, but
yeah.
What are you looking at? Let's think this year and then any sustainability strategy for operators.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I'll use ACC as sort of the national barometer for student housing, and they were right around 90%. I mean, they tend to have probably they have above average locations and product for the most part, being a large institutional owner, but they're a reasonable barometer for the space, and they're a publicly traded company, so they report their information. So they were, at 90% or so this year. This was a black swan event. I mean, if student housing took that kind of a beating and still leads to, let's say, roughly 90%, give or take, then I would expect, we all hope there's a vaccine, obviously, next year, and things resume even some closer to normal state going forward. I would expect occupancy to be better next year, whether it's fully back to, in upper 90s, or if that's kind of low to mid 90s, but anywhere from 3 to 5 points better going forward.
Yeah, this is a key question because it really speaks to, what we do as it relates to valuing these assets. And the major risk exposure for student housing is if you miss the leasing cycle and you're not fully, if you're not 90% plus occupied for the school year, because, new students aren't just going to magically show up. So if you miss it, and you're at, let's say 70%, you might not be covering your debt service at that level, A, and B, we can't sell that asset for you. Because 1, a lender won't lend on it, and 2, we're not going to be able to get anywhere near the value that the owner probably thinks it's worth at 70% occupancy. So one really important distinction about student is that you really are only as good as your last leasing cycle. And we see a lot of scenarios where people are, 90, 95% occupied, 2 years ago, and this year they're at 60, and that's a massive change in value, so it's something that you really have to take it, and that's really your risk exposure, which is very different than multifamily, because, multifamily is in cycle to cycle.
Nice, thank you. And we've got another question for, this is from Michael Blackman. What is the viability of repurposing both antiquated housing and or big box stores to a viable student housing facilities, assuming location is proximate to the university?
Certainly antiquated, housing and upgrading that, if it's well located, I don't see, that's been going on and has been going on for a very long time. I think you'll continue to see that. And one thing you see in student housing is with all the new development over the last 10 years or so is that older product that's nearby has had to kind of renovate to keep up with the Joneses a little bit. And I think you'll see more of that. There's just, with an increased supply of new build, if you're sitting there and, dated, And, you know, some of that is also just changing taste. Millennials, call it whatever you want. You know, their expectation is for a newer, nicer place than perhaps it was like when I went to school. And you know, as far as box stores, I mean, I don't, that I have no idea. I mean, you know, as land, certainly if they're close to a campus, I don't think I mean, more rural schools, there could be big box stores that are actually pretty close to a university campus. Most of the time they're going to be a little further out. But as a land play, sure, certainly.
Yeah, I think if you can do that, you know, if you're sort of doing a value add on a property, you know, you really want to be, you know, 20 to 30% lower on rents than, you know, the Class A highest rents in the market. You know, if you can do that, you can remain full. If you are trying to compete with those Class A properties and, you know, top level rents, you're going to struggle.
And then moving right along on the questions here. For the next school year, what is your strategy for pre-leasing? Since for this fall semester is ending earlier, Thanksgiving, so are you starting earlier to pre-lease? Plus, students might be hesitant to pre-lease since they don't know what's going to happen with COVID. What are you seeing in pre-leasing?
You know, it's yeah, sorry for the dog there. That's a standard around here. So it's an interesting question. We have seen some leasing where with some, you know, if you sign a lease like this early in the year, they'll give you an out at a certain point, you know, if the trends change. But I really haven't seen much. In fact, we've seen some pre-leasing get pushed back as we kind of wait to see how all this stuff's sorted out. It's, again, a mixed bag, but I would say by and large for next year, there's not huge changes in the works for pre-leasing that I've seen.
Yeah, I think it might be too early to call that, because what we really need is more data on this school year to see how it goes, you know, to see how people respond to online learning, if they feel like, you know, the ROI was there on the education, and if you know, it makes sense to continue doing that. And so I think we need some more data on, you know, do kids and parents alike, you know, feel like it's a good return on their investment to come back next year.
Awesome. A couple more that we'll get through before we wrap up here. This comes from an anonymous attendee. What are you seeing / hearing from developers in Big Ten markets in terms of them considering new land acquisition?
Big Ten, still market to market, but I think that in almost all cases, there, you know, if there is a site close to campus that could be acquired and entitled for, you know, let's say 400 plus beds or 500 plus beds, I don't know that there's a market in the Big Ten that there wouldn't be a number of developers who would jump at that. I don't know that they'd be looking at stuff further afield. Again, and maybe it's just a little more selective, but you know, I think across the Big Ten, I mean, I know of projects, you know, in the pipeline or, you know, that are planned for next year at almost all of them. And yeah, again, well-located site next to a major university like a Big Ten school, still going to be here, you know, still in high demand.
Yep, I agree.
And then, you know, before we wrap here, you know, what advice would you share with brokers that are looking to engage with student housing opportunities? Those fresh market and look at student housing.
Stay out of our space.
Yeah,
no,
don't do it.
Yeah. for brokers, listen, it's a great asset class. It's not, it's a cool niche. I mean, it's go to a lot of college towns. I think it's really matured. It's fairly, not to say it's not saturated in any way necessarily, but it is somewhat crowded. There's not just a rampant opportunity like there might have been 10 or 15 years ago, but there's still opportunity in the space. There are a lot of, it's a relatively, it's a relatively young space, just as an asset class, and just in the people that work in it, which is kind of exciting. I mean, when we go to the conference, it's a lot of people in their, 20s and 30s and 40s that have been in this space because it hasn't been around that long. I mean, as opposed to something like office or industrial, whatnot, it's been around for forever. So it's an exciting space to be in. It'll be interesting to see how things shake out here over the next couple of years, but there's always opportunity.
Yeah, I would say start a little further down, on the food chain in terms of who you're reaching out to. One unique thing about student that's different than almost every other asset class I know is, you could probably count on one hand the number of brokers who control, probably 80 to 85% of the transactions in the country, which is really unique and honestly something we didn't really know until we got into it. But I think if you're trying to get into it, you start local, you start with kind of mom and pop owners, and, you sort of start, there as opposed to calling on, the top 10 groups in the country, because I promise you they already have relationships in place.
And to all of our attendees, I've launched the exit poll here. If you could go ahead and fill that out before leaving. Also, if you missed any part of this webinar or you'd like a recording, feel free to email myself. If you have a question that wasn't answered, I know a lot of you did, please reach out to our guests directly. Ryan and Sean have put their emails in the chat as well. If you have trouble finding it, you can always send me an email. I'm happy to forward it over to them. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It's always
you, Yannis.
Nights, especially on such timely and important topics. We really appreciate your time today. I know you're all very busy, so thanks for taking the time to sit down with me this morning.
Can you make me one of those neon signs?
I will. We'll get you.
Yeah, Triad logo. I want that. That'll be up here on my wall next time we chat.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be the first, so we'll. All right. Gentlemen,
Thanks, Yannis.
thank you for everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.